The dust settled slowly across the plains outside Miller's Creek, a small town that existed more by accident than design. It was a kind of place where nobody asked too many questions about anyone else's past, where a woman living alone with a daughter could vanish into the background of daily life without raising much curiosity. That anonymity had been exactly what Catherine Morgan needed when she'd arrived 15 years ago with a 3-year-old girl and a name that wasn't quite her own. Her daughter, Sarah, was now 18, tall and beautiful in a quiet way that turned heads despite her mother's best efforts to keep her unremarkable. Catherine had deliberately chosen a modest cottage on the edge of town, encouraged Sarah to wear plain dresses, and discouraged any romantic entanglements with the local boys. In her heart, Catherine knew this couldn't last forever. Eventually, Sarah would grow restless with a confined life, would want the freedoms and futures that normal young women dreamed of. But Catherine had hoped for a few more years of safety, a few more years before the ghost of her past came calling. That hope was shattered on a Thursday afternoon in late September, when the Corbin gang rode into Miller's Creek looking for trouble, and found it in the form of a beautiful young woman drawing water from the well outside her mother's property. There were 5 of them, led by Buck Corbin, a man whose face had been scarred by a knife fight that had left him looking perpetually angry. He'd been riding the Outlaw trail for 15 years, robbing trains and settlers, leaving dead men and ruined lives in his wake. When he saw Sarah, something ugly lit up in his eyes, the look of a predator spotting something it wanted to possess. Catherine was inside the house when she heard Sarah scream. The sound rocketed through her chest like a bullet, activating instincts that 15 years of attempted domesticity had never fully suppressed. She moved to the window and saw what was happening. Corbin had grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward his horse while his men laughed. Sarah was struggling, terrified, and calling for her mother. Catherine's hands had begun to shake, not with fear, but with something older and far more dangerous. She reached into the loose floorboard beneath her bed, the one she'd maintained all these years despite her promises to herself that she'd never need it again, and pulled out the rifle she'd kept hidden. It was a Sharp's rifle, beautiful and deadly, the tool that had earned her a name in the West that most people had forgotten or never known. They'd called her the Phantom, back when she was younger and angry and far more willing to take lives for causes that had seemed righteous at the time. She'd been a hired gun in the border conflicts, a woman who'd chosen violence as her profession because she was better at it than anything else. She'd been ruthless, celebrated in certain circles, feared by enemies. And then she'd met James Morgan, a man trying to build something honest in a dishonest land. She'd fallen in love with him not despite her violence, but because he'd seen it and chosen to love her anyway. They'd married in secret, and when Sarah was born, Catherine had laid down her guns and promised James she would become the woman he believed she could be. Then James had died, a senseless accident with a horse that had made Catherine understand that the universe cared nothing for promises or redemptions. She'd become a widow, a single mother, and she'd spent the last 15 years trying to honor the man she'd loved by being the kind of woman he believed in. She'd succeeded, mostly. She'd built a quiet life. She'd raised a daughter with gentleness and moral clarity. She'd tried to erase the Phantom entirely. But the Phantom, it seemed, couldn't be erased. She could only be put to sleep, waiting for the moment when the old self was needed again. Catherine moved onto the cottage front porch, the rifle raised with the fluid grace of someone who'd fired thousands of rounds without thinking about the mechanics of it. Muscle memory and muscle truth. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. The world had narrowed to a single point of perfect clarity. "Release her," Catherine called out, her voice carrying the same steely authority it had possessed in her previous life. Buck Corbin turned, still holding Sarah, and his scarred face twisted into a grin. Well, the pretty widow's got herself a gun. That's adorable. Boys, look at this. The first shot took his hat clean off, the bullet passing so close to his head that the wind of its passage made him stagger backward. Catherine had deliberately aimed to miss the kill shot. That came later. For now, she wanted maximum terror before she dealt death. "I won't miss again," Catherine said, working the lever action with brutal efficiency. "And the next shot will take your leg. The one after will take your arm. I can keep you alive and suffering for a very long time, or you can release my daughter immediately and ride out of this town. You have 10 seconds to choose." Buck released Sarah, who stumbled forward toward the house with a cry of relief and fear. The other 4 men, who'd been laughing moments before, had gone very still. They'd heard the shot, heard the certainty in Catherine's voice, and recognized someone who'd done this before and would do it again without hesitation. "You don't want to do this, lady," Buck said, spreading his hands in what he probably thought was a conciliatory gesture. "Let's talk like reasonable people." Catherine fired again. The bullet struck the ground 3 inches from his left boot, kicking up a plume of dust. 8 seconds. "We're going," one of the other men shouted, his hand already moving toward his horse's reins. "Buck, get on the horse." For a moment, Buck looked like he was going to do something spectacularly stupid. His hand started to move toward the gun at his hip, and Catherine simply sighted down the barrel and waited. The other men saw the same thing Catherine did. This woman would kill him without blinking, without hesitation, without a shred of guilt. Buck saw it too, in that moment. He saw the absolute absence of mercy in Catherine's eyes. He mounted his horse and rode out of Miller's Creek at a gallop, his men following, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the sound of pounding hoofbeats. Catherine stood on the porch with a rifle lowered slightly, watching them go, making sure they didn't circle back. Only when they disappeared beyond the ridge did she allow herself to breathe. Sarah was sobbing on the porch, half in shock, and Catherine set the rifle down carefully before pulling her daughter into her arms. Sarah clung to her, trembling, and Catherine held her without speaking, without explaining, without making any excuses for what her daughter had just witnessed. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered finally, pulling back to look at her mother with new eyes. "Who are you really?" There was no hiding it anymore. The secret that Catherine had guarded so carefully was now exposed, and she understood that lying would only make things worse. Sarah deserved the truth, even if the truth was complicated and ugly and filled with things a mother wished a daughter would never have to know. They sat on the porch steps as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep purple, and Catherine told her story. She told Sarah about the woman she'd been before, the sharpshooter called the Phantom, the hired gun who'd been faster and more accurate than anyone else in the West. She told her about the lives she'd taken, the causes she'd served, the evolution from violence to something approaching peace. "Your father," Catherine explained, "believed I could be more than what I'd been. He loved me not despite who I was, but because he saw who I could become. And I did become that person. I laid down my guns, and I built a life of quiet and safety. That was my promise to him, and I've kept it until today." "Are you sorry?" Sarah asked, "for what you did out there?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "I'm not sorry for saving you, but I am sorry that you had to see me that way. I'm sorry that the ugliness of the world is still so close, that I couldn't keep it away from you forever." "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "Will they come back?" "Probably not," Catherine said. "Buck Corbin isn't stupid enough to face me twice. But there's a possibility that he'll try to find men willing to come after us, men who want revenge or want to make a name for themselves by killing the Phantom. That possibility has always existed. I chose to ignore it because I wanted the life I built with your father. But I can't ignore it anymore, not now that you're at risk." Sarah was quiet, processing everything. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but filled with a kind of sorrow that shouldn't have existed in someone so young. "You're going to send me away, aren't you? For my own safety." "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "That would be the smart thing to do. But I also know you. You're stubborn and brave and your father's daughter in all the best ways. Sending you away might protect you from external threats, but it would break something inside you, and I won't do that. I won't ask you to live in hiding the way I've been living." Over the following weeks, life in Miller's Creek transformed. Catherine stopped hiding. She began training Sarah to shoot, not because she wanted her daughter to follow in her footsteps, but because knowledge was power and safety. The townspeople whispered when they realized that the quiet widow on the edge of town was actually the legendary Phantom. Some were terrified, some were impressed, and a few were disappointed that she'd chosen such an ordinary life. A new man came to town, a U.S. Marshal named Daniel Cross, sent to investigate reports of the Corbin gang's movements in the territory. He was drawn to Catherine like a compass finding north, recognizing in her a kindred spirit, someone who'd seen violence and survived it and understood its true cost. He came to her house ostensibly to ask questions about Buck Corbin, but they both knew it was something else. "I've heard of you," he said, sitting on her porch one evening while Sarah deliberately stayed inside. giving them privacy. The Phantom. They said you were the deadliest shot in the West. Past tense, Catherine corrected. I was all those things. I'm not anymore. Aren't you? Daniel asked. You saved your daughter from violent men. You haven't lost your skill. You've just learned when to use it. Catherine looked at this man who'd ridden into a quiet life and appended everything with his understanding. I spent 15 years trying to become someone different, someone good, someone worthy of the man who loved me. You succeeded, Daniel said. Catherine, being good doesn't mean never using force. It means knowing when force is the only moral choice. What you did wasn't a betrayal of who you become. It was a perfect expression of it. You protected someone you love. They talked through the evening and into the night, and Catherine found herself telling him things she'd never told anyone, the kills she regretted, the ones that haunted her, the slow realization that violence wasn't in her nature but in her choice. And Daniel listened without judgment, this man who'd spent his life chasing criminals and understanding that the line between law and lawlessness was thinner than most people wanted to admit. By November, Buck Corbin was dead, shot down by marshals and bounty hunters who'd been chasing him since he'd fled Miller's Creek. Catherine received the news with equanimity. She'd known it was likely, had prepared herself for the possibility that she might need to face him again. But fate had decided otherwise. Sarah had recovered from her trauma, had moved through it with a resilience that made Catherine proud. The girl had chosen not to become a sharpshooter like her mother, but she'd chosen to learn, to understand the tool, and to respect its power. More importantly, she'd chosen to stay in Miller's Creek rather than run, to help her mother face the whispers and the changed attitude of a town that now knew her secret. On a cold evening in December, Daniel asked Catherine to marry him. He did it simply, without any of the elaborate romance that convention dictated, and Catherine loved him for it. She accepted simply as well, understanding that what they were building wasn't a passionate beginning but a steady commitment to move forward together. She married him on a winter morning with Sarah standing beside her as a witness. The town came to the wedding, some out of respect for the Phantom's legend, some out of curiosity, some because they'd come to understand that Catherine Morgan was simply a woman who'd survived her past and chosen a better future. That evening, Catherine stood in her new home, Daniel's house, larger and filled with light, and looked at the rifle she'd owned for so long. She didn't hide it anymore, but she also didn't use it. It hung above the fireplace as a reminder of who she'd been and why she'd chosen to become someone different. Sarah came to stand beside her, 18 years old and wise beyond her years. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "The life you lived before?" Catherine considered the question carefully. "I regret the pain I caused. I regret the deaths that haunt me. But I don't regret becoming myself, even if that self was someone dangerous. And I don't regret laying down the guns when I met your father, or keeping that promise for 15 years, or saving you from those men." She looked at her daughter. Regret is complicated in this life. The important thing is knowing why you make the choices you do and being able to live with the consequences. Years later, long after Catherine had lived a full and honest life with Daniel, long after Sarah had married and had children of her own, the legend of the Phantom had been forgotten by most. But in Miller's Creek, people remembered the day the widow had taken up her rifle and reminded everyone that sometimes the gentlest people carry the deepest strength. Catherine Morgan had learned something that most people never understood, that redemption wasn't about erasing your past. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and choosing every day to be better. She had been a sharpshooter and a killer. She had also been a widow, a mother, and a woman capable of building something good and honest and true. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered.